Hello everyone. So this is Dr. Ramesh Gumasa, Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at SR University, Warangal. In the previous lecture, we discussed about food chain, food web, followed by the pyramid structure. Right. So in this lecture, we'll discuss about biodiversity and its conservation. So coming to the introduction, so you can see Earth, which contains enormous variety of living organisms, which is ranging from microscopic bacteria to giant trees. Right. So Earth contains enormous variety of living organisms, starting from bacteria, trees, and animals. So this variety of life is called biodiversity. Right. It contains variety of animals like a variety of organisms in the range of bacteria, trees and animals. So this variety of life which is called as biodiversity. Okay. However, biodiversity is not evenly distributed across the planet. Okay. So the biodiversity is not evenly distributed across the planet. Like you can see tropical rainforest which contains extremely rich biodiversity because of favorable conditions like high temperature, heavy rainfall and abundant sunlight. Right. So for tropical rainforest, so which contains extremely rich biodiversity environment because of high temperature and high rainfall because of higher sunlight. Okay, because of these parameters which is favorable for higher biodiversity like a rich biodiversity. And second, you can see in case of polar regions and deserts where you can see fewer amount of species, like fewer number of species which are available, right? Why? Can you think why? Because environmental conditions are harsh, right? In the desert and whatever the polar regions which is having fewer amount of species because of the harsh environmental conditions, so that the availability of resources are less. Okay, the availability of resources are limited. So biodiversity is important because every organisms in the nature is interconnected. Okay, biodiversity is important because every organism in the nature is interconnected. Like you can see plants, animals and microorganisms which are together to maintain ecological balance. Right? What happens if biodiversity is decreases? If biodiversity decreases, ecosystem becomes unstable. Okay, if biodiversity decreases, ecosystem becomes unstable. So it will affect on food supply, climatic regulations, and finally on human survival. Okay, so biodiversity is important for food supply, climate, as well as a human survival. Okay, so from this slide you can understand that earth which is supports vast diversity in the living organisms. So biodiversity which is not evenly distributed across the planet. You can see the tropical regions which is having rich biodiversity, but in case of polar and desert region where the biodiversity is very low because of harsh environmental conditions and the influence factors like climatic conditions, temperature, rainfalls and availability of resources. Okay, these are the factors which can influence the biodiversity. Okay, so maintaining the biodiversity which is crucial for ecological balance, for food supply, climatic regulations and human survival. So from this slide you can see that so biodiversity is variety and variability of living organisms in a region, right? So in a simple way you can say that biodiversity, which refers to the variety and variability of living organisms in a particular region. Okay, so which includes different species of organisms, genetic differences within the same species, and different ecosystems and habitats. Okay, so biodiversity includes all form of life like plants, animals, microorganisms. Okay, so biodiversity, which covers in the form of life, you can see in terms of plants, animals and microorganisms, so which will reflect the complexities of earth, the complexity of life on the earth, right, which reflects the complexity of life on the earth and the relationships among the organisms. Okay, so biodiversity is not limited to visible organism alone. Okay, even microorganisms plays a major role in maintaining ecosystem functions, like in terms of decomposition and nutrient cycling. Like example you can say decomposers like bacteria and fungi. Okay, even though these are placing a major role in maintaining ecosystem functioning. Okay, so biodiversity, which is having variety and variability of living organisms in a region, so which includes different species and variation among the species and different ecosystem, so which will cover different forms of life in the ecosystems like plants, animals and microorganisms, so which represents the complexity of living system on the earth. So now can you think what are the key characteristics which is required for biodiversity? So in the previous slides you can understand about general definition and importance of biodiversity, but what are the key characteristics which are required? Okay, can you think once? Because here biodiversity exists at different levels and which is continuously changes with respect to the environmental conditions, right? There are different levels in the biodiversity and which is changing with respect to the environmental conditions, so it is a dynamic. So the behavior is like dynamic. So because of the species evolution and migration, adaptation, and sometimes becomes extinction. Okay. So the major factors which influence the biodiversity are: first one is climate, second one is temperature, third one is rainfall, and the fourth one is geographical isolation. Okay, so which is influenced by environmental conditions like climate, temperature, rainfall, soil condition and geographical conditions. Like geographical location you can see, so with whatever the biodiversity which is rich in one condition and which is vary in terms of desert and polar related regions, right? Because of there is no harsh environmental conditions. Because of the harsh environmental conditions there is very less in the biodiversity, right? So which is influence on geographical location. So there is higher biodiversity, which leads to greener and greater ecosystem stability. Okay, so greater ecosystem stability because of higher biodiversity. So which better resilience to disturbances, right? So you can see, for example, a forest with many plant species can recover faster from pest attacks as compared to the forest dominated by the single species, right? Forest with many plant species can recover faster from pest attacks compared to the forest dominated because of the single species, right? And what are the levels in the biodiversity? What are the levels of the biodiversity? So here the biodiversity is classified or divided into three major levels. So the biodiversity is classified or divided into three main levels. So first one is genetic diversity, and second one is species diversity, and third one is ecosystem diversity. Okay, first one is genetic diversity, and species diversity, followed by ecosystem diversity. So these are different levels which are interconnected to each other. Okay, these are the different levels in the biodiversity, but which are interconnected to each other. Okay, so the changes at one level which are directly affect on other level also, because each level is interconnected. Any changes in the one level which is also affecting on other level in the biodiversity, right? For example, you can take loss of ecosystem diversity, which can reduce species diversity, right? Loss of ecosystem diversity which is affect on species diversity as well as genetic diversity. Okay, so the loss of ecosystem diversity which can reduce species diversity, and which is also directly affect on genetic diversity. Okay, this loss reducing the species diversity, so they are reducing the genetic diversity also. Okay, so understanding these levels can help to scientists and environmentalists so to develop proper conservation strategies. Okay, understanding these levels which is important for scientists and environmentalists to develop a proper conservation strategies. Okay, so the biodiversity is classified into different levels, starting from genetic diversity, species, and ecosystem diversity. So each diversity is interconnected to each other. So any changes in the ecosystem diversity, example, you can take ecosystem diversity, which is effect on species as well as genetic diversity. Okay, and what is genetic diversity? What is genetic diversity? So genetic diversity refers to the variation in the genes within a species. Okay, so genetic diversity means that variation of genes within the species. Okay, so members of the same species may be differs in terms of size, color, growth rate, and resistance to the diseases, right? Even though same species which is having different in the size, color, growth rate, resistance to diseases. Okay, so which is depends upon the genetic diversity. So genetic diversity which represents variation in the genes within a species. So examples you can take like different varieties of rice, different breeds of dog. So the genetic diversity is essential because it improves adaptability, right? It improves the adaptability and survival, right? So organisms with higher genetic variation can survive environmental changes more effectively. Okay, higher genetic variation can survive environmental changes more effectively. For example, some crop varieties may resist drought. Some crop varieties may resist drought while other resist pests. Okay, some crop varieties which resist the drought, but some other resist the pest. So this diversity protect agriculture from complete failure. Okay, this diversity protect the agriculture from complete failure, because some of them are resistant to the drought conditions, and some of them resistant to the pest conditions. Okay, so this kind of diversity is required for agriculture so that it cannot fail you. And next one is related to the diversity. Species diversity. Species diversity. So which means that the variety of species which is present in the area. Okay, species diversity is nothing but so variety of species in the specific area, like it indicates an ecological richness of the area. Okay, species diversity is nothing but which indicates a variety of species in the area, so that we can understand ecological richness in the area, right? Examples, you can take tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest which contains thousands of species. Okay, tropical rainforest which contains thousands of species. And you can see desert ecosystem, desert ecosystem. So desert ecosystem having fewer amount of species. Okay, tropical rainforest having highest amount of species, so the biodiversity is higher. But in case you can see desert ecosystem, the availability of species is low, so the biodiversity is lower, right? So species diversity is considered as important indicator in the ecosystem health, right? Species diversity which is an important indicator of ecosystem health, because ecosystems with more species are generally more stable and productive. Okay, so ecosystem with more species are more stable and more productive. And what are the components in the species diversity? So what are the components in the species diversity? So species diversity has two major components. So which is having two major components. So first one is species richness, species richness, and second one is species evenness, species richness and species evenness. So what is species richness? What is species richness? Species richness is nothing but the total number of species which are present in the ecosystem. Okay, the total number of species which present in the ecosystem. And species evenness, which is nothing but the distribution of individuals among the species. Okay, so this is nothing but distribution of species individuals in the ecosystem. Okay, so a balanced ecosystem which is required for uh, both high richness and high evenness of species. Okay, so a balanced ecosystem have species richness as well as species evenness. Okay, so what will happen, which is not balanced case, if one species dominate excessively, ecosystem balance may be disturbed, right? So if it is having more species which is dominate excessively in the ecosystem, so which leads to disruption in the balance of ecosystem, right? For example, you can take a forest with many equally distributed species. A forest with equally distributed species which is healthier than forest, right? So forest distributed with healthier, but the forest is dominated by only one species, right? Example, you can understand forest which is having equally distributed species and which is healthier forest, but you can see which is critically dominated because the available type of species is only one. Okay, there is imbalance in the biodiversity, species biodiversity, right? And second one is ecosystem diversity. Ecosystem diversity, so what is ecosystem diversity? Ecosystem diversity means the variety of ecosystem within a region, right? So variety of ecosystem within a region, right? You can take examples like forest ecosystem. forest ecosystem, grassland ecosystems, desert ecosystem, and aquatic ecosystem. So these are the different examples for ecosystem diversity because the variety of ecosystem conditions in the region, right? So each ecosystem which supports unique biological communities and environmental condition. Okay, so there are different ecosystems like in terms of forest, grassland, desert, and aquatic. So each ecosystem supports unique biological communities like in terms of organisms and environmental conditions like temperature, rainfall, etc. Okay, so different ecosystems which provide different ecological services. So different ecosystems which provide different ecological services and which is affecting on habitats for organisms. Okay, so each ecosystem which supports unique biological communities, right, in terms of different ecological services. And what are the values of biodiversity? So from this slide you can see that biodiversity which provides several important benefits like in terms of ecological value and economic value, social value, ethical value, aesthetic value, okay, which provides multiple benefits in terms of different values like economic, ecology, social, ethical, and aesthetic. Okay, so these values explains why biodiversity conservation is essential for both the nature as well as a human society. Okay, so now we are moving to the ecological value. So what is ecological value? Ecological value which is required biodiversity, so which is required for biodiversity maintenance, like in terms of maintaining the biodiversity. So ecological balance which is required for supporting food chains, which is required for supporting the food chains and food webs. Okay, which required for supporting the food chains and food web. So which maintain ecological balance in the ecosystem, right? And which is also supports for nutrient cycling. Okay, which is also support for nutrient cycling and which is regulate for climatic conditions like in terms of soil fertility, right, and climatic regulation. So this is the foundation of ecosystem functioning. Okay, ecological value which maintains ecological balance and support for food chains and webs, and which is support for nutrient cycling and which regulates the climatic conditions and which is the most important foundation of ecosystem functioning. Okay, so you can see one example, plants which absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen, right? So which helps to regulate the atmospheric composition, okay, which will absorb carbon dioxide and which is releases oxygen. So which is support for atmospheric composition. Similarly, microorganisms which decomposes organic matter and which releases nutrients into the ecosystem. Okay, so without this biodiversity, ecosystem functioning will be collapse. Okay, so there is failure of biodiversity functioning. So without ecological value. And the next one is related to the ecological value. So ecological value which provides biodiversity resources like in terms of food, like food, timber, and other raw material resources, and which can be used for medical related purpose. Okay, it supports agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and pharmaceutical industries also. So many modern medicines which are derived from the plants, right? Many modern medicines which are developed based on the plants and microorganisms. So biodiversity also contributes significantly national economy in terms of tourism as well as natural resources for the industries. Okay, so which is important for national economy as well as in terms of tourism and natural resources for the industries and pharmaceutical industries also. Okay, which is contributed for national growth as well as a global economy, developing some generating some global economy. Okay, in terms of agriculture, industries and livelihood. Coming to the social value, so biodiversity has strong cultural and social value, right? You can see the examples. So in terms of sacred forest, sacred animals, religious plants like tulasi and indigenous communities, so which possesses traditional ecological knowledge which is developed over the centuries, right? Religious plants like tulasi and indigenous communities like traditional ecological knowledge, so which is coming from the centuries. Okay, so this biodiversity also strengthens social value. So biodiversity which is also strengthen the social value. So in terms of cultural identity and human connections with the nature. Okay, so this social value which strengthens the cultural diversity like cultural identity and human connections with the nature. Okay, so this biodiversity linked with the cultural traditions, with the human connections with the nature. Okay, in terms of different indigenous knowledge and in terms of relations between the humans with the nature. And the next one is related to the ethical value. So every species has right to exist regardless of its usefulness to human. Okay, so humans have a moral responsibility to protect the biodiversity because all organisms are interconnected. Okay, humans have responsibility to protect the biodiversity because everything is interconnected. So humans depends on ecosystem for survival and conservation is important for biodiversity. So therefore, a scientific necessity is required for ethical balance and which promotes respect of all the form of life. Okay, so ethical values plays a crucial roles because everything is interconnected. And coming to the aesthetic value, biodiversity enhances natural beauty. Okay, which enhances natural beauty and which improves human well-being. Okay, which enhances natural beauty and which improves human well-being. Okay, you can see some of the benefits which includes like recreation, ecotourism, mental relaxation and environmental appreciation. Okay, like you can see example like forest, mountains, lakes and wildlife. So this area which attract tourists, okay, which these kind of areas will attract the tourists and improve the quality of the life. Okay, improving the quality of life of human beings. Okay, so aesthetic value also plays a crucial role in the biodiversity which enhances the natural beauty and which supports the recreation for especially in terms of tourism and which will improving the mental well-being for human to improve our quality of life. Okay, so overall it will contribute environmental appreciation and importance of biodiversity. So biodiversity which maintains ecosystem stability. right? Biodiversity maintains ecosystem stability and which supports ecosystem services like which purifies water, regulate the climate, and which supports the human survival. So you can see the key relationships: higher biodiversity, stable ecosystem. So higher biodiversity, stable ecosystem, and lower biodiversity, fragile in the ecosystem. Okay. So disturbance in the one components of biodiversity which directly affecting on entire ecosystem. For example, you can take extinction of pollinators, which can reduce crop production and food security. Okay, because of this pollinator, which can reduce the crop production as well as food security. Okay. So summary from this lecture. So we'll discuss about the biodiversity, which is an important foundation of life in the earth. Okay, every organism which contributes directly or indirectly to the ecosystem functioning. Human activities such as deforestation, pollution, urbanization, and climate change, which are threaten the biodiversity, right, which are disturbing the biodiversity. So protection of biodiversity is essential for maintaining the ecosystem balance and ensuring the sustainable development and securing for future humanity. Okay, so conservation should be important so that we can take better responsibility of governments and scientists and industries and individuals. Okay, so the responsibility is important from among all. Okay, so biodiversity, which is represent different levels in the ecosystem. There are three primary levels like genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. So which all are provides different values in terms of economic, ecological, and social benefits. So which are essential for economic sustainability. Okay, thank you.